My name is Sarah Mitchell, and I'm a 40-year-old marketing director living in Portland, Oregon. I drive a sensible Honda Civic, own a 2-bedroom condo in the Pearl District, and haven't missed a single mortgage payment in 8 years. I have a master's degree in business administration, manage a team of 12 people, and pull in a 6-figure salary. By any reasonable measure, I'm what most people would call a successful adult. But apparently, my father didn't get that memo. The morning of my 40th birthday started like any other Tuesday in March. Rain drummed against my bedroom windows, creating that familiar Pacific Northwest symphony that had become the soundtrack to my adult life. I'd moved to Portland 12 years ago, fresh out of graduate school, determined to build something meaningful away from the suffocating expectations of my childhood home in suburban Detroit. My alarm buzzed at 6:30, and I reached for my phone to silence it. 17 missed calls from my mother. My stomach dropped. Mom never called before 8 in the morning unless someone was dead or dying. I called her back immediately, my heart racing as the phone rang once, twice. "Sarah, honey, thank God." Her voice was strained, tired. "Your father had another episode last night." The word episode had become our family's euphemism for Dad's increasingly frequent outbursts of rage and confusion. What started as occasional mood swings 3 years ago had evolved into something none of us wanted to name. The doctors had run tests, prescribed medications, suggested therapy. Dad had refused most of their recommendations with the stubborn pride that had defined him my entire life. "How bad this time?" I asked, already calculating flight times and work obligations in my head. He threw his dinner plate at the wall, called me by your grandmother's name for 2 hours. Then he sat in his chair and cried like a baby. Mom's voice cracked. "Sarah, I can't do this alone anymore. I know it's your birthday, but could you maybe come home for the weekend, just to help me figure out what to do next?" My reflection stared back at me from the dark window. 40 years old today. I'd planned to treat myself to dinner at that new French restaurant downtown, maybe catch a movie, call it an early night. Instead, I was booking a red-eye flight to Detroit. "I'll be there tomorrow," I told her. The next 18 hours blurred together in a haze of airport coffee, delayed flights, and the kind of bone-deep exhaustion that comes from emotional whiplash. By the time I landed at Detroit Metro, the Michigan winter had settled into my bones despite my Portland rain jacket. Mom picked me up in Dad's old Ford pickup, the same truck he'd refused to replace for 15 years. She looked smaller than I remembered, her gray hair pulled back in a messy bun, dark circles under her eyes that spoke of too many sleepless nights. "How was your flight, honey?" she asked, trying to inject normalcy into a situation that felt anything but normal. "Fine. How's he been today?" "Quiet. He's been sitting in his chair since breakfast, just staring at the television. I don't think he's actually watching anything." The house I'd grown up in looked exactly the same from the outside. Same beige siding, same black shutters, same crack in the driveway that Dad had been promising to fix for 20 years. But stepping inside felt like entering a museum of a life that no longer existed. The air smelled stale, like old coffee and resignation. Dad was exactly where Mom said he'd be, slumped in his brown leather recliner, staring at a muted television showing some daytime talk show. He'd lost weight since Christmas, his clothes hanging loose on his frame. His once powerful hands, the same hands that had taught me to throw a baseball and change a tire, now trembled slightly as they gripped the armrests. "Hi, Dad." He looked up at me with eyes that seemed to focus with effort. For a moment, I saw recognition flicker across his face, followed by something that might have been embarrassment. "Sarah, you're here," Mom called. "Thought I'd come visit for a few days." He nodded slowly, then returned his attention to the television. The conversation, such as it was over. That evening, Mom and I sat at the kitchen table, sharing a bottle of wine and trying to make sense of the impossible situation we found ourselves in. The kitchen was exactly as I remembered it from high school, down to the same checkered tablecloth and the ceramic rooster collection on the windowsill. "The doctor says it could be early-onset dementia," Mom said quietly. "Or maybe just depression. They want to do more tests, but you know how your father feels about doctors." I knew. Dad had always prided himself on being self-sufficient, on handling his own problems without outside help. Asking for medical intervention would feel like admitting defeat, and defeat wasn't in his vocabulary. What about medication? Therapy? There have to be options. He won't take the pills. Says they make him feel fuzzy. And therapy? Mom laughed bitterly. You try convincing a 72-year-old auto mechanic to talk about his feelings with a stranger. We sat in silence for a while, listening to the old house settle around us. Somewhere down the hall, Dad was getting ready for bed. His routine as predictable as sunrise. Brush teeth, put on pajamas, check the door locks twice, set the alarm clock even though he'd been waking up at the same time for 30 years. I keep thinking about when you were little, Mom said suddenly. Remember how he used to make pancakes every Saturday morning? You'd sit on that step stool and he'd let you flip them. You were so proud when you finally got one to land right side up. I remembered a lot of things about the man my father used to be. The way he'd race home from work to catch my soccer games. How he'd spend entire weekends teaching me to drive in empty parking lots. His patience infinite even when I ground the gears of his precious pickup truck. The pride in his voice when he introduced me to his friends as my daughter, the college graduate. That man felt like a stranger now. The next morning, I woke up in my childhood bedroom, surrounded by faded posters of boy bands and participation trophies from high school sports. The room was a time capsule, preserved exactly as I'd left it when I moved out for college 22 years ago. Mom had always said she kept it ready for when I came home, but looking around at the remnants of my teenage years, all I felt was the weight of expectations I'd spent decades trying to escape. Downstairs, I found Dad at the kitchen table, methodically eating oatmeal and reading yesterday's newspaper. He looked up when I entered, and for a brief moment, his face brightened with something resembling the warmth I remembered. Morning, sweetheart. Your mother made coffee. It was the most normal interaction we'd had in months. I poured myself a cup and sat across from him, watching as he turned the pages with careful precision. His hands were steadier today, his movements more deliberate. Dad, we need to talk about getting you some help. The newspaper crinkled as his grip tightened. I don't need help. I'm fine. You're not fine. Mom's not fine. This situation isn't sustainable. He set the paper down and looked at me with eyes that held flashes of the sharp intelligence that had once intimidated my high school boyfriends. You think because you've got some fancy job in Oregon, you can come back here and tell me how to live my life? The words stung because they carried an echo of old arguments, old resentments that had never been fully resolved. My decision to leave Detroit, to build a life 2,000 miles away from everything familiar, had always been a source of tension between us. That's not what this is about, isn't it? You left, Sarah. You made your choice. You don't get to come back now and play the concerned daughter when it's convenient for you. The accusation hit like a physical blow. Yes, I'd left. Yes, I'd built a life that didn't revolve around family obligations and small-town expectations. But I'd also visited for holidays, called regularly, sent money when times were tight. I'd thought that was enough. Maybe it wasn't. That afternoon, while Dad napped in his chair, Mom and I drove to the grocery store to pick up supplies for what was supposed to be a belated birthday dinner. She'd insisted on making my favorite meal from childhood, pot roast with mashed potatoes and green beans, as if comfort food could somehow bridge the growing chasm in our family. The grocery store was the same one where I'd worked as a teenager, bagging groceries and saving money for college. Walking through those familiar aisles, I felt the weight of circular time, the way life had a tendency to bring you back to places you thought you'd left behind forever. I've been thinking about what you said yesterday, Mom said as we loaded the cart with ingredients. About getting your father help. Maybe it's time to look into some kind of assisted living situation. The words hung between us like a death sentence. Assisted living meant admitting that the man who had once seemed invincible was now unable to care for himself. It meant acknowledging that the independence he'd valued above almost everything else was slipping away. We don't have to decide anything today, I said. Let's just get through dinner. But even as I said it, I knew that avoiding the conversation wouldn't make the problem disappear. Dad's condition wasn't going to improve on its own, and Mom couldn't continue carrying the burden alone. Something had to change, whether we were ready for it or not. Back at the house, we found Dad in the living room, looking through old photo albums. The pictures were spread across the coffee table like fragments of a life being examined for clues. There was my high school graduation, his arm around my shoulders, both of us grinning at the camera. My college graduation, where he'd worn his best suit and told everyone who would listen that his daughter was going to change the world. Look at this one, he said, holding up a picture of me at age 7, missing 2 front teeth and wearing a Little League uniform. You wanted to play baseball so bad that summer. I told you girls didn't play baseball. They played softball. You threw such a fit. I remembered. I also remembered that he'd eventually signed me up for the boys' Little League team when I refused to back down. He'd sat in the bleachers for every game that season, cheering louder than any other parent when I got my first hit. You always were stubborn, he continued, his voice carrying a note of pride that I hadn't heard in years. For a moment, the three of us existed in a bubble of shared memory, connected by the invisible threads that bind families together despite distance and disappointment. It was fragile and precious, this glimpse of who we used to be. Then Dad closed the album, and the moment was gone. Dinner was a quiet affair, punctuated by the sound of silverware against plates, and the occasional comment about the weather. Dad ate mechanically, his attention drifting in and out of the conversation like a radio picking up distant signals. Mom and I did our best to maintain normalcy, discussing safe topics like neighborhood gossip and changes to the local shopping center. It wasn't until we were clearing the dishes that the evening took an unexpected turn. Sarah, Dad said suddenly, why don't you go sit with the kids while your mother and I finish cleaning up? I stopped mid-step, a stack of plates balanced in my hands. Excuse me? The kids' table, in the dining room. Let the adults handle the kitchen work. The words hit me like cold water. I looked at Mom, who was staring at Dad with a mixture of confusion and horror. There were no kids in the house. There was no kids' table. I was 40 years old, and my father was asking me to sit at an imaginary children's table while the grown-ups took care of business. Dad, it's just us here, and I'm 40. Today's actually my birthday. He looked at me blankly, as if I were speaking a foreign language. Your birthday isn't until next month. Don't try to fool me, young lady. The casual dismissal of my adult status, the reduction of 4 decades of life to young lady, felt like being erased. I stood there holding dirty dishes, watching my father disappear further into whatever fog was claiming his mind, and felt something fundamental shift inside me. I'll finish the dishes, Mom said quietly. Sarah, why don't you go call it a night? I set the plates down carefully, afraid that if I moved too quickly, I might shatter something more than just dinnerware. Without another word, I walked upstairs to my childhood bedroom and closed the door. Sitting on the twin bed where I'd once dreamed of escape and adventure, I felt the weight of a terrible irony. I'd spent so many years fighting to be seen as an adult by my parents, particularly my father. I'd moved across the country, built a successful career, proven my independence in every way that mattered. And now, when I was finally, unquestionably a grown woman with nearly 2 decades of adult experience behind me, my father's mind was reducing me back to childhood. The cruel joke was that part of me had always craved his approval, had always wanted him to see me as capable and worthy of respect. Now, even if I achieved everything I'd ever dreamed of, it wouldn't matter. The disease that was stealing his memories was also stealing his ability to witness who I'd become. I pulled out my phone and scrolled through the birthday messages that had been accumulating all day. Friends from Portland wishing me well, colleagues sending funny memes, my ex-boyfriend Mark asking if I wanted to grab drinks when I got back to town. Normal adult interactions from people who saw me as I actually was, not as a confused shadow from my father's deteriorating past. But somehow, none of those messages carried the weight of my father's misguided dismissal. His opinion still mattered in ways I hadn't fully understood until this moment. I found myself thinking about the last real conversation we'd had, maybe 6 months ago during a phone call that had started pleasant enough. He'd asked about my job, and I'd told him about a successful campaign I'd managed, how we'd exceeded all our targets and earned recognition from the corporate office. There had been a pause, and then he'd said, "That's nice, sweetheart. When are you going to find a nice man and settle down?" At the time, I'd been frustrated by his inability to see my professional achievements as valid on their own, without the context of traditional milestones like marriage and children. Now I realized that conversation might have been one of the last times he'd engaged with my adult life at all, even if his engagement came filtered through his own generational expectations. The house grew quiet around me as the evening settled into night. Through the thin walls, I could hear my parents moving through their bedtime routine, the same patterns they'd followed for decades. The familiar sounds should have been comforting, but instead, they felt like echoes from a life that was slowly disintegrating. Tomorrow, I would have to return to Portland, back to my real life with its deadlines and responsibilities, and the kind of problems that could be solved with hard work and strategic thinking. But I would be leaving behind a situation that had no clean solutions, no project timeline that could impose order on the chaos of aging and illness. As I lay in the dark, staring at the ceiling I'd memorized during countless childhood nights, I tried to imagine what the next few months would bring. More phone calls from Mom, more difficult conversations about care options and medical decisions. More moments like tonight, where the man who had once been my hero struggled to recognize the woman his little girl had become. The hardest part was knowing that this was just the beginning. Whatever was happening to Dad's mind, it wasn't going to reverse itself. There would be more confusion, more lost memories, more times when 40 years of my life would be reduced to a misplaced child who needed to sit at the kids' table. But lying there in my childhood bed, I made a decision that felt like both surrender and rebellion. I wouldn't let his illness erase the relationship we'd actually had. I wouldn't let the fog of his confusion obscure the memories of Saturday morning pancakes and Little League games and the pride in his voice when he'd introduced me as his college graduate daughter. If he couldn't remember who I'd become, then I would remember who we'd been together. I would carry those stories forward, even when he could no longer tell them himself. The rain had started again outside my window, a gentle rhythm that reminded me of Portland mornings and the life I'd built 2,000 miles away from this room. But for tonight, I was content to listen to Michigan rain and hold space for the complicated love that exists between parents and children, even when that love gets tangled up in illness and misunderstanding and the cruel tricks that time plays on all of us. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges. Tonight, I was exactly where I needed to be, even if my father couldn't quite remember why. The next morning brought no relief from the emotional weight of the previous evening. I woke to the sound of my father moving around downstairs, his footsteps heavy and deliberate on the old hardwood floors. The smell of coffee drifted up through the heating vents, mixed with something else that took me a moment to identify: burned toast. I found him in the kitchen, standing over the sink with a blackened piece of bread in his hand, staring at it as if it held answers to questions he couldn't quite formulate. The toaster was still smoking slightly, and I could see he'd already thrown away at least 2 other failed attempts. "Morning, Dad. Having trouble with breakfast?" He looked up at me with eyes that seemed clearer than they had the night before, but there was something else there too, a kind of desperate frustration that made my chest tighten. "I can't remember how long to set the timer," he said quietly. "I've been making toast for 50 years, and I can't remember something as simple as how long to toast bread." The admission hung between us like a confession. This wasn't about me being treated like a child anymore. This was about a man confronting the reality of his own mind's betrayal. I reached over and adjusted the toaster dial, then put in 2 fresh slices of bread. "Medium setting usually works best," I said. 3 minutes or so. He nodded, but I could see him trying to memorize the information, as if he could force his brain to hold on to this simple fact through sheer will. We stood there in silence, watching the toast brown through the little window, both of us pretending that this ordinary moment wasn't loaded with the weight of everything we weren't saying. Mom appeared in the doorway, already dressed for the day in her usual uniform of jeans and a sweater that had seen better years. She took in the scene, the burned toast in the garbage, the careful way Dad was watching the toaster, the tension in both our postures, and I saw her shoulders sag slightly. "I called Dr. Patterson's office," she said. "They can see us this afternoon if we want to discuss those test results." Dad's jaw tightened. "I don't need to discuss anything with anybody. Frank, please. We need to know what we're dealing with." "I know what we're dealing with. I'm getting old and my brain is getting scrambled. A doctor isn't going to fix that with a pill and a pat on the head." The toast popped up, perfectly golden brown. Dad looked at it with something approaching wonder, as if he'd performed a small miracle. He buttered it carefully, methodically, and took a bite. For a moment he looked satisfied. Then he turned to me. "Sarah, what are you doing here? Shouldn't you be in school?" The question hit me like a punch to the gut. Yesterday I'd been relegated to the kids' table. Today I was apparently supposed to be in school. In his mind, I was regressing from a dismissed adult to an actual child. "Dad, I'm 40 years old. I came to visit because Mom was worried about you." He stared at me for a long moment, his face cycling through confusion, embarrassment, and something that might have been grief. 40. Right. I knew that, but I could see that he didn't know that. Not really. The number was just something he was repeating because I'd said it, not because it held any meaning for him. To him, I was still the little girl who'd sat on his shoulders at baseball games, who'd begged him to read just one more bedtime story. The afternoon at Dr. Patterson's office was an exercise in polite medical euphemisms and carefully worded prognoses. The doctor, a kind woman in her 50s who'd been treating Dad for years, spoke in the gentle but direct tone that medical professionals use when delivering news that no one wants to hear. "The test results are consistent with what we discussed before," she said, her hands folded on the desk between us. "We're looking at early-stage dementia, most likely Alzheimer's disease. The progression varies from person to person, but we need to start thinking about long-term care planning." Dad sat in his chair like a statue, his face expressionless. Mom gripped my hand so tightly I could feel her wedding ring pressing into my fingers. I found myself focusing on that ring, on the way it had worn smooth over 43 years of marriage, rather than processing the words that were reshaping our family's future. "What does that mean exactly?" I asked. "In practical terms?" Dr. Patterson pulled out a pamphlet, the kind of glossy educational material that makes devastating diagnoses seem manageable. "Memory loss will continue to progress. There will be good days and bad days, but the overall trajectory is downward. Eventually, he'll need full-time care." "How long?" Mom's voice was barely above a whisper. "It's hard to say. Could be months, could be years. The important thing is to start making decisions while Frank can still participate in the process." I looked at Dad, waiting for him to object, to insist that he didn't need anyone making decisions for him. But he was staring at the pamphlet in Dr. Patterson's hands as if it were a foreign object, something that couldn't possibly have anything to do with his life. "There are excellent facilities in the area," the doctor continued, "places that specialize in memory care. I can give you some referrals." "He's not going to a nursing home," Mom said firmly. "Not while I can still take care of him, Mrs. Mitchell. I understand that impulse, but caring for someone with dementia is incredibly demanding. It's not just about love, it's about having the right resources and support systems." I wanted to say something, to contribute to this conversation that was determining the shape of our family's future. But what could I say? That I lived 2,000 miles away and couldn't be here to help? That my successful career and independent life suddenly felt insignificant compared to the reality of my father's declining mind? Instead, I sat there holding my mother's hand and watching my father disappear into himself, one memory at a time. The drive home was silent except for the low hum of the truck's engine and the occasional creak of old suspension springs. Dad stared out the passenger window at the familiar streets of his neighborhood, but I couldn't tell if he was seeing them as they were now, or as they existed in some earlier version of his memory. "I want to go home," he said suddenly. "We are going home, Frank," Mom replied gently. "No, I want to go home, to my mother's house. I want to see my mother." Mom's hands tightened on the steering wheel. Dad's mother had been dead for 25 years. "Your mother isn't there anymore, honey. Remember? We talked about this. I want to go home," he repeated, his voice taking on a childlike quality that made my stomach turn. "I want my mother." We spent the rest of the drive in silence, each of us trapped in our own version of grief. Dad mourned for a mother who existed only in his confused memories. Mom mourned for the husband who was slowly disappearing, and I mourned for the father who could no longer see me as the woman I'd become. That evening, I found myself in the basement, surrounded by boxes of family photographs and mementos that Mom had been meaning to organize for years. I told myself I was looking for something specific, but really, I was seeking evidence of the man my father used to be, proof that the confusion and fear I'd witnessed weren't the whole story. I found it in a shoebox labeled "Sarah School Years" in Mom's careful handwriting. Inside were report cards, school photos, and dozens of pictures from various activities and events. But what stopped me cold was a letter, written in Dad's distinctive handwriting on letterhead from the auto shop where he'd worked for 30 years. It was addressed to my college admissions counselor, written during my senior year of high school when I was applying for scholarships. The letter was a recommendation, but it was unlike any formal recommendation I'd ever seen. It was personal, emotional, and completely inappropriate for its intended purpose, which made it perfect. "Sarah Mitchell is my daughter," it began, "and I'm writing to tell you that she's the smartest, most determined person I know. She gets that from her mother, not from me, but I like to think I taught her how to work hard and never give up." He went on to describe specific moments from my childhood, the way I'd practiced free throws in the driveway until I could sink 10 in a row, How I'd read every book in the children's section of the library before I was 12, the time I'd built a working volcano for the science fair using materials I'd scrounged from his workshop. She's going to do something important with her life, the letter concluded. She's going to be somebody. I know that sounds like something every parent would say, but with Sarah, it's true. She's got something special inside her, and I've watched it grow stronger every year. Whatever you decide about her application, I want you to know that she's already made me proud. I sat there in the dusty basement, holding this letter that had never been sent, and cried for the man who had written it. This was the father I remembered, the one who had seen me not as a child to be dismissed, but as a person with unlimited potential, the one who had believed in me even when I didn't believe in myself. When I finally went back upstairs, I found my parents in the living room, watching the evening news. Dad was in his usual chair, but something about his posture was different. He looked smaller, more fragile, as if the day's revelations had physically diminished him. "Did you find what you were looking for down there?" Mom asked. I held up the letter. "I found this. Dad wrote it when I was applying for college scholarships." Mom's face softened. He spent hours on that letter, rewrote it 3 times because he wanted to get it just right. Then he decided it was too personal to send. Too personal for what? For strangers to read. He said it was nobody's business how much he loved you except you. I looked at Dad, who was watching the news with the kind of intense concentration that suggested he was trying very hard to follow the stories. I wondered if he remembered writing the letter, if he remembered the girl he'd described with such pride and affection. "Dad," I said softly, "do you remember writing this?" He looked up at me, and for a moment, his eyes focused with startling clarity. "I remember everything about you, sweetheart. Every single day from the moment you were born until right now. The problem is, I can't always remember when now is." The admission was so lucid, so perfectly articulated, that it took my breath away. This was the man I'd been searching for, the father who had always been able to find exactly the right words when they mattered most. "I know you're not a little girl anymore," he continued. "I know you're successful and independent and everything I hoped you'd become. But sometimes my brain gets confused about time, and I see you as you were instead of as you are. It doesn't mean I don't know who you really are. It just means I can't always find the right moment to put you in." I knelt down beside his chair, the letter still in my hands. "I understand. Do you? Because I need you to understand that when I tell you to sit at the kids' table, it's not because I think you're a child. It's because my brain is playing tricks on me, and I can't always tell if you're 7 or 40. But in my heart, I know exactly who you are. You're my daughter who moved to Oregon and became somebody important. You're the little girl who used to help me make pancakes on Saturday mornings. You're both of those people, and I love both of them." The tears came then, hot and unexpected. I reached for his hand, and he squeezed mine with surprising strength. "I'm scared," he whispered. "I'm scared of losing more than I've already lost." "I know. I'm scared too." We sat there for a while, holding hands in the glow of the television, while Mom watched us with tears streaming down her face. Outside, the Michigan winter was doing what it always did, making everything seem harder and more beautiful at the same time. The next morning brought the kind of clarity that sometimes follows emotional breakthroughs. Dad was more like himself than he'd been in days, asking about my job, my life in Portland, my plans for the future. It was as if our conversation the night before had cleared some of the fog that had been clouding his mind. "Tell me about your work," he said over breakfast. "The real stuff, not just the highlights." So I told him about the challenges of managing a team, about the politics of corporate life, about the satisfaction of seeing a campaign succeed beyond expectations. He listened with the kind of attention I remembered from childhood, asking follow-up questions that showed he was truly engaged. "You know what I'm proud of?" he said when I finished. "I'm proud that you didn't let anyone tell you what you couldn't do. Remember when you wanted to play baseball instead of softball? Everyone said girls didn't play baseball, but you didn't listen to them. You didn't listen to them either. You signed me up for the boys' league. Damn right I did. And you showed them what a girl could do with a baseball bat." It was a good memory, uncomplicated by the confusion and fear that had marked our recent interactions. For a few minutes, we were just a father and daughter sharing stories, connected by the invisible threads of shared history. But good moments with dementia are fragile things. By afternoon, the fog had rolled back in, and Dad was asking me when I was going back to high school. By evening, he was calling me by my mother's name from 40 years ago. I extended my trip by 2 days, then 3, then a week. Every time I called the airline to change my flight, I told myself it was just one more day, just until I could see one more moment of clarity from the man who had raised me. But eventually, I had to accept that those moments were becoming rarer, and that staying longer wouldn't create more of them. I had a life to return to, responsibilities that couldn't be indefinitely postponed. The morning I left, Dad was having one of his better days. He helped me carry my suitcase to the car, and when I hugged him goodbye, he whispered, "I love you, Sarah. I'm proud of the woman you've become. I love you too, Dad. Take care of yourself out there in Oregon. And don't be a stranger." I promised I wouldn't be, knowing that phone calls would become more difficult as his condition progressed, that visits would become exercises in patience and heartbreak. The flight back to Portland was turbulent, the plane bucking and swaying through storm clouds that seemed to mirror my internal state. I pressed my face to the window and watched the landscape change from the flat expanses of the Midwest to the mountainous terrain of the Pacific Northwest, each mile taking me further from the man my father was becoming and closer to the life I'd built in spite of his expectations. But something had shifted during that week in Michigan. The sting of being told to sit at the kids' table had evolved into something more complex, a recognition that my father's diminishing ability to see me as an adult wasn't really about me at all. It was about his brain's cruel trick of making the present feel like the past, of reducing a lifetime of memories to fragments that didn't always fit together coherently. Back in Portland, my condo felt simultaneously foreign and familiar. My mail had piled up, my plants needed water, and my inbox was full of messages from colleagues wondering where I'd been. The ordinary details of my life demanded attention, but they felt strangely insubstantial after the weight of the previous week. I threw myself back into work with the kind of intensity that had always been my default response to emotional turmoil. There were campaigns to manage, deadlines to meet, meetings to attend. My team welcomed me back with a mixture of relief and curiosity, and I found myself deflecting their questions about my family emergency with vague references to health issues and family obligations. But late at night, alone in my apartment with the city lights twinkling beyond my windows, I would think about Dad sitting in his chair, staring at the television and trying to make sense of a world that no longer quite made sense to him. I would remember the letter he'd written but never sent, the pride in his voice when he'd talked about my achievements, the way he'd looked at me during those moments of clarity and seen both the child I'd been and the woman I'd become. 3 weeks after I returned to Portland, Mom called with news that Dad had gotten lost driving to the grocery store. He'd ended up 20 miles away, in a parking lot he didn't recognize, unable to remember how he'd gotten there or how to get home. A kind stranger had called the police, who had brought him back to Mom. "I think it's time to take away his keys," Mom said, her voice heavy with the weight of another small death. I knew what that meant. For a man who had prided himself on his independence, who had built his identity around his ability to fix things and go places and solve problems, losing the right to drive was like losing a fundamental part of himself. How did he take it? He hasn't spoken to me since. He's been sitting in his chair for 2 days, just staring at the wall. I booked another flight. This time, when I arrived in Michigan, I found a man who seemed to have aged years in the weeks since I'd left. Dad was thinner, quieter, and more withdrawn. He looked at me with eyes that held only occasional flickers of recognition, as if I were someone he'd known once but couldn't quite place. "Dad, it's Sarah. I came to visit." He nodded politely, the way you might acknowledge a friendly stranger. "That's nice of you." We had crossed some invisible threshold. The father who had been able to articulate his fears and acknowledge his condition was gone, replaced by someone who existed in a perpetual state of confused politeness. He was kind to me, but it was the kindness of a host entertaining a guest, not the warmth of a parent recognizing his child. Over the next few days, I helped Mom research assisted living facilities, a task that felt like planning a funeral for someone who was still alive. We visited cheerful places with names like Golden Years Manor and Sunset Gardens, where activities directors spoke in bright, encouraging tones about craft time and movie nights and field trips to local attractions. Dad came with us to one of these visits, shuffling through the hallways with the blank compliance of someone who had given up trying to understand what was happening to him. He nodded when the director explained the meal schedule, and smiled when she showed him the recreational areas, but I could see that none of it was penetrating the fog that had settled over his mind. "What do you think, Mr. Mitchell?" the director asked brightly. "Does this seem like a place you'd like to call home?" Dad looked around the common room, with its carefully arranged furniture and motivational posters, and shrugged. "I suppose it's fine." It was the response of someone who had stopped believing that his preferences mattered, that he had any control over the direction of his life. I wanted to shake him, to demand that he fight back, to insist that he reclaim some small piece of the stubbornness that had defined him for 72 years. But I was beginning to understand that the disease wasn't just stealing his memories, it was stealing his will to resist. The decision to move Dad into Sunset Gardens was made with the kind of bureaucratic efficiency that major life changes often require. Papers were signed, deposits were paid, and a move-in date was scheduled. Throughout the process, Dad remained passively cooperative, as if he were helping to plan someone else's life. The day of the move was gray and cold, with the kind of bitter wind that cuts through winter coats and settles into your bones. Mom and I had spent the morning packing Dad's belongings into boxes, trying to decide which pieces of a lifetime were essential enough to follow him to his new home. His clothes fit into 2 suitcases, 43 years of marriage and 72 years of life, reduced to what would fit in a single room with a twin bed and a small dresser. "Should we bring the photo albums?" Mom asked, holding up one of the many volumes that documented our family's history. I thought about Dad's increasing inability to place faces and names, the way he sometimes looked at pictures of himself as if he were viewing strangers. Maybe just a few, the ones with the clearest pictures. As we worked, I found myself cataloging memories attached to the objects we were packing or leaving behind. The coffee mug with the chipped handle that Dad had used every morning for as long as I could remember. The reading glasses that had been carefully placed on the nightstand beside his bed. The worn leather wallet that contained his driver's license, credit cards, and a picture of me from my college graduation. Each item told a story of the man he'd been, but they were stories he might no longer remember. We were packing the props of a life that existed now primarily in other people's memories. Dad supervised the packing from his chair, occasionally pointing out something he wanted to take or asking about objects he no longer recognized. "What's that?" he asked, pointing to a small wooden box on the dresser. "It's where you keep your cufflinks," Mom explained. "The ones you wear to church." He nodded as if this made perfect sense, but I could see the confusion in his eyes. He no longer remembered owning cufflinks or going to church, but he accepted the explanation with the same polite interest he might show for a stranger's hobbies. The drive to Sunset Gardens was mercifully short. Dad sat in the passenger seat, watching the familiar streets of his neighborhood disappear behind us, but showing no signs of distress or recognition. He might have been moving to a new city for all the emotional connection he displayed to the places he was leaving behind. At the facility, a cheerful aide named Jennifer helped us carry Dad's belongings to his new room. It was smaller than I'd expected, with beige walls and fluorescent lighting that gave everything a slightly surreal quality. There was a window that looked out onto a small garden, and a roommate who was napping in the other bed. "This is nice," Dad said, looking around the room with the same polite interest he'd shown during our initial visit. "Very nice." Jennifer began unpacking his clothes, chatting about the facility's amenities and the schedule of activities. Dad listened with the patient attention of someone who had learned to let conversations wash over him without trying too hard to follow their meaning. "Dinner is at 5:30, Jennifer explained. "Tomorrow is bingo night, and on Thursday we have a visiting musician who plays oldies but goodies. I bet you'll enjoy that." "I'm sure I will," Dad replied, but I heard the uncertainty in his voice. He was agreeing to a future he couldn't quite imagine, in a place that didn't feel like home. As we prepared to leave, I struggled with what to say. How do you say goodbye to someone who might not remember the conversation in an hour? How do you express love to a person who no longer quite knows who you are? I hugged him, feeling how thin he'd become, how fragile his frame felt in my arms. "I love you, Dad." "I love you too," he replied, but I could hear the uncertainty in his voice, as if he were repeating a phrase he'd learned was appropriate for moments like this. Walking away from him, leaving him in that sterile room with a stranger for a roommate, felt like the hardest thing I'd ever done, but I also knew it was necessary. Mom couldn't continue caring for him alone, and he needed more help than either of us could provide. The drive back to Mom's house was silent except for the sound of her quiet crying. When we got home, she went straight to the bedroom she'd shared with Dad for 4 decades and closed the door. I found myself alone in the living room, staring at his empty chair and trying to process the magnitude of what had just happened. My father, The man who had taught me to drive and throw a curveball and stand up for myself was now living in a place where strangers would help him remember to eat and shower and take his medication. The progression of his disease had been relatively swift, but the emotional impact felt like a slow-motion catastrophe that had been building for months. I stayed in Michigan for another week, helping Mom adjust to the rhythm of visiting Dad at the facility and trying to rebuild some semblance of normalcy in her suddenly quiet house. We went to see him every day, sometimes finding him alert and engaged, sometimes finding him staring at the wall with the blank expression that had become increasingly common. On my last day, I visited him alone. He was sitting in the common room, watching a television show that seemed to hold no interest for him. When I approached, he looked up with a polite smile that contained no recognition. "Hello," he said pleasantly. "Are you here to visit someone?" The question hit me like a physical blow. I was no longer his daughter coming to see him. I was just another visitor, indistinguishable from the volunteers and staff members who moved through his days. "I'm here to see you," I said, sitting down beside him. "I'm Sarah." He nodded as if this were interesting information that had no particular relevance to his life. "That's a pretty name." We sat together for an hour, watching television and making small talk about the weather and the food and the other residents. He was kind and polite, but it was the politeness of a stranger being friendly to another stranger. The man who had once been my father was still physically present, but the connection that had defined our relationship for 40 years was gone. When I left that day, I knew it would be the last time I'd see him as anything more than a pleasant old man who happened to share my DNA. The father-daughter relationship that had shaped my identity, for better and worse, had ended not with a dramatic confrontation or a meaningful goodbye, but with a polite conversation between two people who no longer recognized each other. Flying back to Portland, I thought about the cruel irony of how it had all unfolded. I'd spent so much of my adult life trying to prove to my father that I was capable and independent, that I could succeed without his approval or support. Now, when I'd finally achieved the kind of success that should have made him proud, he could no longer understand what I'd accomplished. The validation I'd been seeking for decades was no longer available, not because he disapproved of my choices, but because the disease had stolen his ability to comprehend them. I was finally, unquestionably, a successful adult, and my father would never know it. But perhaps that was the point. Perhaps the real measure of growing up wasn't whether your parents recognized your adulthood, but whether you could recognize it yourself. I was 40 years old, financially independent, professionally successful, and emotionally mature enough to understand that my worth wasn't determined by my father's approval. The man who had once told me to sit at the kids' table was now living in a world where time moved in circles, where the past and present blended into a confusion of faces and voices that he could no longer organize into coherent narratives. His dismissal of my adult status hadn't been a judgment of my capabilities. It had been a symptom of a mind that was losing its ability to process the linear progression of time. I was not a child who needed to sit at the kids' table. I was a woman who had built a meaningful life 2,000 miles from home, who had learned to navigate the complexities of adult relationships and professional responsibilities, who had found the strength to love a parent whose mind could no longer fully reciprocate that love. The plane descended through the clouds toward Portland, and I looked down at the city lights spreading out below me like a constellation of possibilities. Tomorrow, I would return to my job, my apartment, my carefully constructed adult life. I would make decisions about marketing campaigns and budget allocations and strategic planning. I would meet deadlines and manage conflicts and solve problems that had real-world consequences. And I would do all of this not because my father could see and approve of my competence, but because I had become the person he'd always believed I could be, even when his failing mind could no longer hold on to that belief. The kids' table, I realized, was not a place I could be sent to anymore. It was a place I had outgrown through experience and time, and the accumulated weight of choices that had shaped me into who I was meant to be. My father's disease had stolen many things from our family, but it could not steal the fact that I had become exactly who I was supposed to become. I was 40 years old, and I was finally, fully, grown up.